I never really took fasting seriously. I'd been a pastor for years, teaching others about prayer, worship, and having a strong faith in God. But fasting was different. It always felt like just one of those optional religious rituals, something I'd do occasionally if I needed a breakthrough or guidance on an important decision. To be honest, I mostly thought of it as a kind of bargaining tool with God, a way to show seriousness and maybe speed things up a bit. But everything changed on a random Tuesday night while I was alone in my study, preparing a sermon and feeling oddly restless, as if something deep inside was tugging at me, like God was trying to get my attention. At first, I tried to brush off that nagging feeling. Maybe it was stress or exhaustion. I had a packed schedule that week: counseling appointments, church meetings, sermon prep, and the usual family commitments. But when I woke up the next morning, the feeling was even stronger. It wasn't an audible voice, but more like a deep weight pressing into my chest, gently but insistently saying, "You need to fast." I argued back internally, asking, "God, is this really you? Or am I just making things complicated?" But as soon as I opened my Bible that morning, the words from Matthew 9 jumped off the page at me, about fasting being connected to longing for God's presence. Right there, in that quiet morning moment, I knew this wasn't just my imagination. God was clearly calling me into something deeper. I'd fasted briefly before, 2 or 3 days at most, but the idea of going 40 days drinking nothing but water was daunting, to say the least. Honestly, it sounded almost impossible. I wondered how I'd manage everyday tasks, ministry obligations, or even just functioning normally around my family. But that sense of urgency kept growing, and deep down, I felt it was something I had to do, no matter how uncomfortable it made me. The first few days were incredibly challenging. My mind kept drifting back to food. My stomach cramped painfully, and I felt exhausted just climbing stairs or standing up from my chair. I almost quit multiple times, but slowly, something shifted inside me. Around day 5, the hunger became less intense, replaced by a new sensation: clarity. My mind felt clearer, my thoughts sharper, and my prayers more focused. For the first time in years, it felt like the spiritual static was fading, allowing me to truly sense God's presence in a tangible way. By day 9, I was in a completely different mental and spiritual place. Physically weaker, sure, but spiritually stronger than I'd ever felt before. I woke up early that morning with an unusual sense of anticipation, almost like something important was about to happen. My original plan was to spend the entire day alone in prayer, but mid-morning, my phone buzzed with an urgent call from a member of my congregation. His wife had collapsed suddenly and was in critical condition at the hospital. He pleaded desperately for me to come pray with them. Even though I'd intended to avoid distractions, I immediately felt a strong, undeniable nudge from the Holy Spirit to go. I grabbed my keys, Bible in hand, and rushed out to my car, whispering quick prayers under my breath. The drive was quiet, almost surreal, with the sun casting a gentle golden glow across the familiar streets of Austin. As I approached a major intersection, I glanced up briefly, noticing a large truck barreling toward the intersection from the left, clearly running the red light. My heart stopped. I didn't even have time to brake or swerve before the violent impact sent everything spinning into chaos. The crash was unlike anything I've ever experienced. There was this deafening sound, metal grinding, glass shattering, followed by a brief moment of complete silence. My body jerked forward, the seatbelt digging painfully into my chest, and then everything went black. It was as if I had completely disappeared. No pain, no sound, no thoughts, just nothing. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, or maybe I had passed out. But then, something strange happened. I woke up, but not in the way you'd expect. I wasn't in my body. I was hovering above the wreck, watching everything unfold with surreal clarity. I could see my own lifeless body slumped against the broken windshield, blood trickling from a wound on my forehead, my chest barely moving. I wasn't scared or panicked. In fact, there was an overwhelming sense of peace, like everything was unfolding exactly how it was supposed to. I could hear people's thoughts, worries from the truck driver, the frantic urgency of the paramedics, the desperate prayers of a woman watching from a distance across the street. Everything felt strangely detached, yet profoundly clear. as if I was seeing everything from a perspective I'd never had before. Seconds later, the paramedics arrived. I watched them work on my body, their urgency unmistakable. One of them checked my pulse, shook his head, and started CPR immediately. "No pulse," he called out, and I heard panic rise in their voices. Even though I should have been terrified, I wasn't. In fact, I felt completely at ease, as if I was floating outside of time. Then, in an instant, everything around me began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled upwards. At first, it was subtle, a gentle tug like being drawn into the air. But soon the force grew stronger, like something was pulling me up with a power far beyond my own. I had no control, yet I didn't feel fear. I was being pulled into a tunnel of light, but not just any light. This wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It shimmered, pulsed, and radiated hues beyond human understanding. The further I went, the more peace, love, and joy enveloped me. It wasn't just light. It was as if the very essence of God's presence was all around me, saturating my being. I knew exactly where I was going. I was going home. As I moved deeper into that tunnel of light, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just my physical body or my surroundings, it was my entire being. I felt like I was being drawn into the heart of something indescribably pure and vast. It wasn't like I was just traveling through a tunnel. It felt more like I was being enveloped by the light itself, as if the light was alive, aware of me, and welcoming me. The deeper I went, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, like every worry, every burden, and every fear I'd ever carried on earth simply melted away. I wasn't just floating. I was experiencing an intimacy with the divine that I had never known before. And as strange as it sounds, there was no time. It was as though time had no hold on me, like everything existed in a state of eternal now. And then finally, I came to a place I can only describe as heaven. Words fail me in trying to describe it properly, but I'll do my best. Imagine the most beautiful, peaceful, and vibrant place you could ever dream of, and then multiply that by infinity. The sky above me was unlike anything we know on Earth. It wasn't just blue or even a bright shade of light. It was alive, shifting in hues of gold, sapphire, and amethyst, and it radiated warmth that felt not just physical, but deeply spiritual. The very air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that was both powerful and comforting, and I could hear music, not from any instrument, but woven into the very atmosphere itself. The melody was sweet, resonating through every fiber of my being. It wasn't a song I recognized, but it was a song I knew. I felt it in my soul, and in that moment, I understood that everything, even the air itself, was worshiping. Looking around, I saw meadows of flowers that shimmered in the light, their colors more vivid than anything we have on Earth. The scent in the air wasn't just any fragrance. It was pure, holy, and love itself, filling every part of my being. The ground beneath me was soft, almost like it was alive too, and each blade of grass seemed to hum with energy. I saw people, many people, moving gracefully, dressed in flowing robes of light. Some were kneeling in awe before a throne that shimmered with divine brilliance, while others were in joyous conversation. Their faces shone with the kind of peace I had only dreamed of, and it was as if they were completely in tune with the divine presence all around them. The whole place was alive with worship, with peace, with love. But what struck me most deeply was the sense of belonging. It wasn't just a place. It was a reality that was far more real than anything I'd ever known on Earth. There was no hunger, no pain, no anxiety. There was just completeness, and I felt more alive than I had ever felt in my entire life. As I took all of this in, I suddenly noticed something that seemed impossible, but was so clear. Golden threads of light stretching from earth to heaven. These threads were countless, some thin, others thick and pulsing with power. And I understood without being told that these threads were more than just light. They were prayers, they were fastings, they were the spiritual connections between earth and heaven. I understood that these golden threads were pathways, conduits for the divine to flow between these realms, enabling heaven's power to touch earth in ways we could never fully grasp. As I stood there, in this realm so far beyond my comprehension, I felt a profound realization sinking in. Everything in heaven, every sound, Every sight, every breath, seemed to be woven together in perfect harmony. There was no division, no dissonance. Everything existed in unity, as though every living thing, every moment was designed to reflect the glory of God. It wasn't just a place of peace, it was a place of total alignment with divine purpose. And for the first time in my life, I understood what true fulfillment really felt like. As I stood in awe, I began to notice the threads of light again. They were everywhere, extending from the earth all the way up into heaven, connecting every person on earth to this divine realm. Some of these threads were faint, flickering as though they could fade at any moment. Others were thick, vibrant, and pulsing with an intensity that seemed to surge with life. I knew without anyone telling me that these threads represented the prayers and fastings of God's people. They were spiritual lifelines, connecting heaven and earth, allowing God's presence, power, and intervention to flow down to His children. I watched as these golden threads intertwined, creating bridges of light between heaven and earth. As they moved, they seemed to carry with them the essence of prayer and fasting, the intense longing for God's presence that ignites something powerful within us. Then, something happened that made my heart stop in awe. I looked toward the throne, where the most radiant figure I could ever imagine stood, Jesus. He was standing there, bathed in indescribable light, more glorious and powerful than anything I had ever seen in my life. It was as if His presence alone filled the entire space, radiating warmth, love, wisdom, and authority that shook me to my core. His eyes were full of eternal wisdom, yet they looked at me with such love and tenderness, as if I were the only person in the universe. I found myself instinctively falling to my knees, overwhelmed by the sheer majesty and purity of His being. I knew it was Him, not just from His appearance, but from the way my spirit recognized Him. He smiled at me, and in that smile, I felt all the answers to all my questions. His presence was overwhelming, and as I knelt before Him, He extended His hand toward me. The next moment, I was no longer standing at the entrance to heaven, but instead, I found myself in a vision that would forever change the way I saw fasting, prayer, and the spiritual realm. As I reached out to take His hand, I felt an energy coursing through me unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just power, it was divine, pure, and filled with such intense love and authority that I felt like I was in the presence of the Creator Himself. The moment I touched His hand, the surroundings around me shifted. I was no longer in the glorious courts of heaven, but suddenly, I found myself witnessing something that took my breath away. Jesus was showing me the spiritual significance of fasting in a way I had never understood. He pointed toward the golden threads, and I could feel His voice, His words, resonating deep within me as He spoke. "Do you see these threads?" He asked, His voice both tender and urgent. I nodded, mesmerized by the sight of these radiant connections between heaven and earth. The threads seemed to stretch infinitely, some glowing brightly, others weak and faint. "These," He continued, "are the prayers and fastings of my people. Fasting creates a direct connection between heaven and earth, opening portals for my presence and intervention." It was like a veil had been lifted from my eyes. What I had always thought was a spiritual discipline was far more than that. It was a powerful weapon. Jesus explained that many of His followers didn't fully grasp the power of fasting. They saw it as a religious duty, something to do for personal gain or breakthrough, but not as a divine strategy that unlocked heaven's resources for a greater purpose. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Fasting wasn't just about denying oneself food or seeking an answer to a prayer. It was a form of spiritual warfare, a divine weapon capable of shifting the atmosphere, breaking chains, and releasing God's power on earth. Jesus showed me more. He waved His hand, and in an instant, the golden threads transformed into vivid living visions, snapshots of history, scripture, and supernatural events, all tied to fasting. I saw Moses standing alone on Mount Sinai, fasting for 40 days before receiving the 10 Commandments. But now, it wasn't just about the physical act of fasting, it was a spiritual transaction. Moses' fasting opened a portal between heaven and earth, allowing God's glory to descend upon the mountain. Then, I saw Daniel in Babylon, praying and fasting. As he fasted, I saw dark forces retreating, the very atmosphere around him shifting as his prayers and fasts pushed back the spiritual oppression over the land. But what really struck me was when I saw Jesus himself in the wilderness, enduring 40 days of fasting. It wasn't just a test of endurance, it was a spiritual battle. Each day he fasted, his authority grew and demonic forces trembled. His power increased, and with every passing moment, he was overcoming darkness. I could feel the weight of his words as he turned to me and said, "Fasting is not about suffering, it is about dominion." Those words shook me to my core. Every day a believer fasts with a pure heart. They grow in spiritual authority. Fasting wasn't about enduring hunger. It was about taking back what the enemy had stolen, about walking in spiritual victory. As I continued to kneel before Jesus, listening intently to his voice, I felt like I was hearing the very heart of God. His words were not just for me, but for all believers. He was showing me something so profound about fasting, something that would change everything I thought I knew about the spiritual life. Fasting, he said, his voice deep and resonant, is not about seeking personal gain or just asking for a breakthrough. It's about engaging in a battle, a spiritual war that is taking place right now, unseen by most. His words sent a shiver through my body. It was as if he was giving me access to a secret knowledge, a hidden dimension of the spiritual realm that few truly understand. I began to see the battlefield, not with physical eyes, but with spiritual eyes. I saw believers fasting, and as they did, waves of light radiated from them, striking at the demonic strongholds hovering over cities, families, and nations. But what struck me most was what came next. I saw some believers faltering in their fasts, their resolve weakening as they gave in to distractions, doubts, and temptations. Some gave up too soon, their golden threads of fasting flickering and fading, while others, those who persisted with a pure heart and unwavering determination, broke through. I watched as their prayers unlocked miracles. People were healed, chains of oppression were broken, and revival spread like wildfire. It was as if their fasting had torn through the spiritual darkness, opening a floodgate of divine power and intervention. Jesus turned his gaze back to me, his eyes filled with both compassion and urgency. "This is why the enemy fights fasting so much," he explained, his voice firm and unwavering. "Satan knows that when my people fast, they engage in spiritual warfare at the highest level. When they fast with a pure heart, they become a force to be reckoned with. They break chains, release healing, and bring revival." His words were like a fire in my soul. I had never fully understood the weight and the authority behind fasting. I thought it was simply about denying oneself, about enduring hunger for a time. But now I saw fasting for what it truly was, a divine weapon, an instrument of war in the unseen realm. I saw the opposition too, the enemy's relentless attacks on fasting believers. Demonic forces tried to distract, discourage, and weaken them, whispering lies to their minds. "It's not working. Just give up. You're too weak. This is pointless." But I saw something else too. I saw believers who, despite the enemy's attacks, refused to quit. They held firm, their faith unshakable, and with each passing day, their golden threads grew stronger, pulsing with divine energy. And as they pushed through the darkness, they brought breakthrough after breakthrough. I witnessed one man, barely clinging to his fast, suddenly breaking through a barrier. In an instant, his prayers unlocked healing in his family, broke demonic oppression, and shifted the spiritual atmosphere over his home. It was like the power of heaven had flooded his life in a single moment. As I listened to Jesus speak, his words sank deep into my heart, and I couldn't help but feel like I was finally being awakened to a truth that had always been right in front of me, but had eluded me for years. I had been teaching about fasting for so long, but it had always been more of a ritual to me, something I did when I needed guidance or wanted to break through in prayer. I never realized that fasting was so much more than that. It was, as Jesus was showing me, a direct engagement in spiritual warfare. It was a tool for overcoming the darkness in the world, a way to break through the walls of resistance in the heavenly realms, a way to release God's power in our lives and in our world. As he spoke, I began to see the fuller picture of what fasting truly is. I saw it as a spiritual transaction, a divine act that brought heaven's power down to earth. I witnessed the ripple effect of fasting, not just in the lives of individuals, but in entire communities, cities, and nations. I saw churches fasting together, their collective prayers and fasts becoming a massive spiritual storm, sweeping away the forces of darkness that had oppressed entire regions. As these believers fasted in unity, the golden threads of light connecting heaven to earth grew stronger and more vibrant, forming a giant spiritual conduit through which God's power surged into the earth. The more they fasted, the more heaven's resources flowed into their lives and their cities. It was as if their collective fasting became a gateway through which divine healing, deliverance, and revival poured into the world. Jesus spoke again, his voice filled with urgency. "Look at what happens when my people fast together. Look at the power they can unleash when they unite in prayer and fasting." I was amazed at what I saw. Entire cities, once held captive by spiritual darkness, were suddenly flooded with light as believers prayed and fasted together. I saw revival breaking out in homes, in churches, and even in entire nations. It was as if fasting, when done in unity, created a divine storm that could sweep away every force of evil, every chain of oppression, and every spiritual barrier that stood in the way of God's will being done on earth. But there was a deeper revelation that Jesus revealed to me that changed everything. He showed me how fasting didn't just impact the present moment, it impacted future generations. I saw a young woman fasting, and as she did, her prayers reached far beyond her own lifetime. I saw her fast opening doors for salvation, not just for her immediate family, but for generations to come. Her fasting didn't just break chains in the here and now, it created a spiritual inheritance that would impact her children, grandchildren, and even descendants she would never meet. This revelation was so powerful, it shattered my understanding of fasting and prayer. It was no longer just an act of personal devotion, it was a divine weapon that carried eternal consequences. Fasting was not just about me or my moment. It was about aligning with God's eternal plan, partnering with Him to bring His kingdom on earth, and impacting future generations. As I stood there, still overwhelmed by the weight of what Jesus was showing me, He continued speaking with an urgency that I had never heard before. His voice carried a profound sense of warning, as if He was telling me something of the utmost importance. "Tell them, Daniel," He said, his eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity. "Tell them that fasting is not optional. It is a divine weapon that must be reclaimed." I could feel the weight of those words deep in my soul, as if they were being etched into my heart in indelible ink. I knew that this wasn't just a personal revelation for me. It was a message meant for the church, for the body of Christ as a whole. Jesus was telling me that the days ahead would require something more from His people. They would need power that many of them had never experienced, power that could only be accessed through fasting and prayer. Without fasting, without engaging in this powerful spiritual discipline, they would not be ready for what was to come. I saw the future in flashes, brief but vivid glimpses of what lay ahead. I saw spiritual warfare escalating to a level that I could scarcely comprehend. The forces of darkness were growing stronger, more deceptive, and more aggressive. The world was becoming a battleground, and many believers would be caught unprepared. I saw churches divided, leaders falling, and families torn apart by confusion and fear. But I also saw something else, a remnant of believers, strong in faith, standing firm in the battle, armed with the power of fasting and prayer. These were the ones who had aligned themselves with God's will, who had cultivated intimacy with Him through fasting, who had gained spiritual authority and discernment through their obedience. They were the ones who would endure, the ones who would stand firm when everything else seemed to be crumbling. As I felt the urgency of Jesus' words, I realized that what He was showing me wasn't just about surviving the trials of life. It was about thriving in them. I saw a vision of a great spiritual conflict, where the enemy was attacking relentlessly, trying to tear down every believer he could reach. The forces of deception, confusion, and fear were sweeping across entire nations. But there was something else I saw too, something incredibly powerful. I saw believers fasting and praying, their golden threads of light blazing bright, connecting heaven and earth in ways that the enemy could not block. Their fasting had created a spiritual force field, a barrier against the attacks of the enemy. As they fasted, the darkness that had once seemed so overwhelming began to recede. Demonic forces were driven back, and chains of oppression were broken. I watched as entire cities, once held captive by spiritual strongholds, began to experience a shift. Revival broke out, healing spread, and lives were transformed. It was as if the very act of fasting had unlocked a floodgate of divine power that began to pour out into the world, breaking through the darkness and ushering in a new season of hope and restoration. Jesus spoke once again, his voice filled with both authority and compassion. This is why I am calling my church back to fasting. The days ahead will require my people to walk in power they have never known before. Without fasting, they will not be prepared for what is coming. The gravity of his words hung in the air as I tried to take in everything he had shown me. It was clear that fasting was not just a matter of spiritual discipline, it was a matter of survival, of victory. Jesus wasn't speaking in mere theoretical terms. He was warning me of the spiritual battles that were already intensifying around us. Battles that would require every believer to be spiritually strong and well-equipped. I saw a woman fasting, praying with everything she had for her lost son. At first, it seemed like nothing was happening. Her son remained far from God, lost in his own world of rebellion and darkness. But then, as she continued to fast, I began to see a shift. I could see the chains that had held him begin to break off in the spiritual realm. The grip of the enemy, which had seemed unbreakable, began to loosen. Her fasting was like a force, pushing against the darkness, driving it back, creating space for God's power to move in her son's life. Slowly but surely, his heart began to soften. I could see the walls he had built up around himself start to crumble. It was as though her fasting was unlocking a spiritual door for him, allowing God's grace to flood in and transform him. I saw his heart turn toward God in ways that seemed impossible before, and it was in that moment that I realized the full impact of fasting, not just for immediate results, but for long-term, generational change. What that woman was doing in her prayer and fasting wasn't just affecting her own life. It was reaching into the future, into her son's life, and the lives of those who would come after him. The more I saw, the more I understood. Fasting was not just about asking God for something. It was about aligning with his will, stepping into partnership with him to accomplish his purposes on earth. It was about breaking down barriers, not just for ourselves, but for others, for our communities, and for future generations. Jesus made it clear that fasting was not an optional practice for the believer. It was essential. He showed me a vision of a great battlefield, one that spanned beyond the physical world. I saw millions of believers, some standing strong, their faith fortified by fasting and prayer, and others weak, their armor broken or missing altogether. The enemy was coming at them with all his might, seeking to weaken and destroy. Some were easily swept away by the waves of deception and fear, while others stood firm, unshaken by the storm. "These are my people," Jesus said, his voice filled with sorrow. "Some have prepared themselves through fasting and prayer. They walk in power. Others have neglected the weapons I have given them and will fall in the battles ahead." His words were a stark warning, but also an invitation. He was calling his people back to fasting, not just as a religious ritual, but as a weapon, a key to unlocking heaven's power and protection in the midst of spiritual warfare. Without fasting, he warned, many would not be ready for the trials ahead. But those who had learned to fast and pray would be equipped to stand firm, no matter how fierce the battle became. The weight of the vision Jesus had shown me settled heavily on my heart. I could see now that the trials we face were not just random struggles. They were part of a larger spiritual battle, one that we couldn't fight with our own strength alone. Without fasting, without connecting to God in a way that transcended the physical realm, we would be vulnerable, unprepared for what was coming. The reality of the future Jesus had revealed to me was unsettling. I saw how spiritual leaders, once strong in faith, were beginning to falter. I watched as they relied on their own strength, on their own wisdom, and slowly they began to lose their way. Some of them abandoned their calling, others compromised their faith, and still others fell into deep despair. I saw churches that had once been vibrant with the Spirit of God become divided, their unity broken, as if they had lost their spiritual grounding. And I realized something crucial. The foundation of the church, of any believer's spiritual life, was prayer and fasting. It was the bedrock that held everything together. Without it, everything else would crumble. I saw the enemy's strategy clearly now. He was trying to wear us down, to distract us from what mattered most. He was using everything at his disposal to break us apart, to cause us to forget the power of fasting, the spiritual weapon that was available to us all along. But in the midst of this vision, I also saw something powerful. Those who had dedicated themselves to fasting, those who had answered the call to go deeper with God, were standing strong. They were not swayed by the waves of deception. They were fortified by the power of the Holy Spirit, and their fasting had opened doors that could never be closed. The more I saw, the more I understood that fasting wasn't just a spiritual discipline. It was a form of spiritual warfare. It was a way of fighting the unseen battles that shape our world, a way of engaging with the divine power of heaven and releasing it into the earth. I saw a man, weary from his fast, on the verge of giving up. He had been fasting for days, praying, seeking God with all his heart, but the breakthrough he was praying for had not come. Yet, as he clung to the fast, I saw something incredible. His prayers, though seemingly unanswered, began to take on a force of their own. I saw his golden thread of fasting surge with energy, as if heaven was listening, as if his persistence was unlocking something in the spiritual realm. And then, suddenly, I saw a breakthrough. His prayers broke through the resistance in the spirit, and in an instant, his family was healed, his relationships restored, and the oppression that had weighed so heavily on them was shattered. It was as if the very act of his fasting had triggered a divine response, opening the floodgates of heaven. Jesus turned to me, and with a gentle but powerful voice, he said, "This is what happens when my people fast with a pure heart. They engage in the highest level of spiritual warfare. They break the chains of the enemy. They release my will on earth." I was shaken to my core. I had never fully understood the power of fasting before. I had always seen it as a practice to earn God's favor or get answers to my prayers. But now I saw it for what it truly was, a way to engage with the very heart of God, to partner with him in bringing his kingdom to earth, to fight against the darkness in ways that words and actions alone could never accomplish. As Jesus spoke, it became crystal clear to me that fasting was not just something we should do when we're desperate or seeking answers. It was something that had to be woven into the fabric of our daily lives, like breathing in and out. It wasn't just a strategy to solve problems. It was a lifestyle, a way of living in constant alignment with God's will. It was the key to staying spiritually sharp, to hearing from God more clearly, and to moving with divine authority in a world that was increasingly being overtaken by darkness. Jesus showed me how fasting wasn't just about getting God to do something for us. It was about opening our hearts to receive his power and to be used by him to change the world. I saw how fasting could not only break chains in our own lives, but how it could bring revival to entire communities. I saw churches fasting together, and as they did, I saw a wave of healing sweep through their congregations. Families being restored, people being set free from addiction and oppression, and spiritual breakthroughs happening in ways that were so powerful, it was impossible to deny that something supernatural was at work. I saw revival break out in cities as believers, once complacent, began to pray and fast with urgency. And I realized then that fasting was the missing link in the spiritual equation for many of us. It was the one thing that was often neglected, the one thing that held the power to release God's will in ways we could never have imagined. I felt the weight of this revelation. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire body of Christ, waking up to the truth that fasting wasn't optional, but essential for what was coming. As I reflected on everything Jesus had shown me, I began to feel a deeper urgency rise within me. I had seen the future. I had witnessed the power of fasting and how it could change the course of history. I had seen entire nations and generations impacted by the prayers and fasts of believers. But I also saw something equally unsettling, the reality that so many believers would miss out on this power. They would continue to live life as usual, unaware of the spiritual battle raging around them. I saw how some would dismiss the idea of fasting, thinking it was just an outdated practice, irrelevant to their lives today. Others would fast for the wrong reasons, out of pride, self-righteousness, or to be seen by others. I saw how these fasts, no matter how outwardly impressive, would have no lasting spiritual effect. Jesus had shown me that the most powerful fasts were those done in secret, with a pure heart, with no desire for recognition or reward. The fasts that moved heaven were the ones that aligned with God's will, the ones that were rooted in humility and love. Those were the fasts that brought breakthrough. But I also saw something else, something even more powerful. I saw how fasting, when done with a sincere heart, could change not only our own lives, but also the lives of those around us, our families, our communities, and even our nations. I saw how one person's dedication to fasting could unlock a spiritual inheritance that would impact generations to come. And I knew then that I could never look at fasting the same way again. It wasn't just a practice to get through tough times. It was a weapon to bring heaven's power into every area of life, to change the course of history, and to prepare us for the spiritual battles ahead. As I sat there, taking in all that Jesus had shown me, I felt this overwhelming sense of responsibility. I had been given a mission, and it was more urgent than I could have ever imagined. Jesus had made it clear. Fasting wasn't just for a select few or for moments of crisis. It was for everyone. It was the spiritual lifeline that connected us to God in a deeper, more intimate way. It was the key to walking in authority, to seeing miracles happen, to shifting the atmosphere in our homes, our churches, and our cities. But I also saw the dangerous path that many would take, believers who would dismiss fasting as a thing of the past, something irrelevant to their lives today. The message I had received wasn't just for me, it was for the whole body of Christ. I could see clearly now how fasting had been neglected, misunderstood, or misused in so many churches and communities. I knew that I had to tell people, to warn them about the spiritual power that was waiting to be unlocked through fasting. But as soon as I made this decision, I also saw the opposition that would come. The enemy wasn't going to let this message spread easily. I saw how he would use doubt, fear, and confusion to keep people from embracing this truth. I saw how he would attack those who would try to share this revelation, making them feel crazy or radical, making them question what they had seen and heard. But I knew that I couldn't stay silent. The urgency in Jesus' voice still echoed in my mind, and the truth he had shown me burned like fire in my chest. I couldn't let it die with me. I had to share it, no matter the cost. As soon as I returned to consciousness, lying in that hospital bed, I knew that my life had changed forever. I had seen heaven, I had heard Jesus speak, and I had received a message that would alter everything I thought I knew about the Christian life. But I also knew that it wouldn't be easy. I had already felt the pushback from the enemy during the vision, and I knew it was only the beginning. The moment I tried to share what I had seen, I was met with resistance. Some of my family didn't believe me. My wife, Rebecca, was confused and skeptical, unsure of what to make of my experience. "Daniel, you were gone for so long," she said, her eyes filled with doubt. "Maybe it was just a hallucination. Maybe your brain was just processing everything differently." Her words stung, but I knew deep down that what I had experienced was real. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was a divine revelation, one that had been given to me for a purpose. I didn't back down. I told her everything, even when I saw the uncertainty in her eyes. And when I shared the story with my church, it was met with a similar response. Some listened with wide eyes, others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to process the things I was saying. Some church members even pulled me aside and cautioned me to be careful with what I was sharing. They said it didn't align with traditional Christian teachings. They wanted me to stick to Scripture, to avoid sounding too radical or extreme. But I couldn't stay silent. I had seen what I had seen. I had heard what I had heard. Fasting was not optional. It was essential, and I had to tell the world. As the days passed, the weight of what I had experienced didn't diminish. It only grew stronger. I began to understand just how crucial fasting was, not just for personal breakthroughs, but for the collective spiritual health of the church. But the more I tried to share this truth, the more opposition I faced. Some of my church members, the ones I had prayed with for years, began distancing themselves from me. They were uncomfortable with the message I was sharing. To them, it seemed too radical, too extreme. They were not prepared for the depth of what I had seen. And as much as it hurt to face rejection from those I had served alongside, I knew I couldn't turn back. Jesus had shown me something so real, so powerful, that I could never go back to life as usual. Fasting was no longer just a part of the Christian walk. It was the very weapon that God had given us to fight the battles ahead. I couldn't keep this to myself. I couldn't ignore the urgency that had been planted in my heart. Even if it meant losing friends or facing criticism, I had to keep speaking out. I started writing about my experience, sharing my testimony through articles, and speaking at conferences where people were willing to listen. The response was mixed, but I was undeterred. The truth I had encountered had the power to change lives, and I knew I had to keep spreading it. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the resistance, when the enemy tried to use doubt and fear to silence me. But every time I prayed, every time I fasted again, I felt the strength of heaven behind me, urging me forward. The message I was delivering was no longer just a sermon or a theological discussion. It had become a call to action, a wake-up call for the church. I couldn't understand why so many were not listening, but I knew I couldn't force it. I had seen with my own eyes the power of fasting, the way it broke chains, healed families, and unleashed revival. I knew that if I could get this message into the hands of those who truly wanted more of God, those who wanted to experience His power and bring His kingdom to earth, it would change everything. Slowly but surely, the message began to resonate with a few, and I could see the shift in their lives. They began to fast with greater intent, with more passion and purpose. And then, I saw the same miracles that Jesus had shown me in that vision start to happen in real life. People were set free. Healings took place. Families were restored. The atmosphere in our church shifted. And I knew deep down that it wasn't just the fasting that was changing things. It was the alignment with heaven, the submission to God's will, the power that came when believers fasted together, united in purpose. I began to see the golden threads that Jesus had shown me. Threads of prayer, threads of fasting, growing stronger and more vibrant in the spiritual realm. I could feel them in my own life, reaching out to connect heaven with earth in a way that nothing else could. As I continued to share my story, something incredible began to happen. I began to witness the true power of fasting in the lives of those who were open to it. It wasn't just about the miracles or the breakthroughs, though those were undeniably important. It was about the deep transformation that began to take place in people's hearts. I saw individuals who had been struggling with addiction, fear, and hopelessness suddenly find freedom through prayer and fasting. People who had been praying for years for family members to come to Christ began to see their loved ones break free from spiritual strongholds. I saw marriages healed that had seemed beyond repair, and families reunited in ways that were nothing short of miraculous. The most incredible part was that it wasn't just the results that were amazing. It was the deep intimacy with God that people started experiencing. Fasting was drawing them closer to the heart of God, and that was where the real power lay. It was in the quiet moments of surrender, the moments when we stopped trying to control everything and simply opened ourselves up to God's presence. That was when the breakthrough came. I saw it in the lives of the people around me, and I knew that the message I had received wasn't just for a few, it was for everyone. I had witnessed a spiritual awakening, not just in my own life, but in the lives of everyone who embraced the call to fast with a pure heart. It was as though we were tapping into something that had been there all along, waiting to be unlocked. And I knew that this wasn't just a season, it was the beginning of something much bigger. I had seen the power of fasting change lives, cities, and nations in the spiritual realm, and now I was beginning to see it unfold in real time. But as I continued on this journey, I also began to realize that not everyone would understand. There were still those who doubted, those who couldn't grasp the depth of what I had experienced. Some still dismissed fasting as a spiritual practice for the super-righteous, something that didn't apply to their lives. It was disheartening at times to see people remain locked in spiritual complacency, not realizing that they were missing out on the very key to unlocking God's power. But I knew that I couldn't force anyone to see it. The truth had been revealed to me, and I had a responsibility to share it. It wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about planting seeds, about being faithful to the calling that God had placed on my life. And as I saw the fruits of fasting begin to multiply in the lives of those who responded, I knew that this message was worth everything. It had cost me dearly. The rejection, the misunderstandings, the isolation, it had all been part of the process, but nothing could compare to the satisfaction of seeing people walk in the power and freedom that came from fasting and aligning themselves with God's will. I had come back from the dead with a mission, and I was determined to fulfill it. As I stood before my congregation once again, ready to share everything I had experienced, I felt a fire in my heart that couldn't be extinguished. I had seen heaven. I had heard Jesus' voice, and I knew that the time had come for the church to awaken to the truth about fasting. As I began to speak, I felt the weight of what I was saying. This wasn't just another sermon. It was a call to action, a warning, and a revelation all at once. Some listened with eager hearts, and others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to make of my words. But I knew that I couldn't back down. I had seen the power of fasting with my own eyes. I had seen chains broken, cities transformed, and lives healed. And I knew that God was calling His people to rise up, to fast with a pure heart, and to prepare for the battles ahead. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. Fasting was no longer an optional practice. It was essential for the church to survive, to thrive, and to fulfill the calling that God had placed on us. I was no longer just a pastor. I was a messenger, one who had received a revelation directly from God about a divine weapon that had been waiting to be reclaimed. I couldn't predict how people would respond to this message, but I knew that it was no longer my job to control the outcome. My responsibility was to be faithful, to share the truth, and to trust that God would do the rest. The vision I had seen, the golden threads, the power of fasting, the spiritual battles, it had changed me. And as I looked out over my congregation, I knew that some would hear it and take action, and others might not. But for those who did, for those who were willing to take this truth and run with it, they would experience a power that would reshape their lives. I had seen it happen in my own life, and I knew it could happen in theirs too. I didn't know where this journey would lead, but I was certain of one thing. Fasting had unlocked a level of intimacy with God and power that I could never have imagined, and I had come back with a message that would change everything. The call to fast was not just a call to seek answers or breakthrough in prayer. It was a call to walk in dominion, to fight in spiritual warfare, and to see God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And I knew, without a doubt, that the church needed to awaken to this truth before it was too late.